All righty, it is 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started here. So just a couple of housekeeping slides before we continue. If you'd like to tweet about the webinar, please feel free to use our handle at AHA Media Group. Do not be afraid to ask questions. I will be answering questions at the end, and it's very, very helpful. I find that the discussions sometimes are even better than the webinar content, although hopefully the webinar content will also be good. So please do not hesitate to ask questions whenever things occur to you. We love to hear from you. You will, of course, receive access to a recording of this webinar as well as the slides. There's a survey that comes up. That survey is incredibly helpful. It lets me know to slow down when I'm talking. It lets me know if the content was valuable to you. There are places for you to put your comments and suggestions about other things you'd like to hear. So please do fill out that survey. And then, of course, if you have topics that you want us to cover in the future, that's also fantastic. This webinar actually came out of several questions that we got, not just from clients, but from people who subscribe to our email newsletter who were asking questions about staffing and virtual content workflows. So this is where the hopefully great ideas come from, and certainly let us know if there's anything you want us to cover. I know there's a lot of webinar fatigue right now, but I do think that it's important to talk about best practices in content because a lot of us are dealing with that. You know, that seems to be some of the #1 problems that we've got. So I hope you'll just listen to my spiel about AHA Media Group. If you're here, hopefully you know a little bit about us, but we are a copywriting and content strategy consulting firm. Our mission is to empower people to make the most important decisions of their lives. We feel privileged. Obviously, we're not frontline healthcare workers, but we do feel that we're on the front line of giving people information about the pandemic, and that makes us very proud of what we do. And we serve hospitals, healthcare organizations, healthcare technology companies to help them communicate in clear English to patients, doctors, any stakeholders within the healthcare industry. So what we do is these 3 sort of product service lines: full-scale content strategies for your websites and digital properties. Copywriting, content development, editing is a huge part of our business, and what we hopefully we excel at all the things, but the copywriting is a huge part of what we do for our clients, and also provide content training. And so the content training that we provide is typically in person, but because we're probably all going to be stuck at home and not traveling for quite a while, there's 4 workshops are now available to you in your organization. We have Writing for the Web, which is typically a full-day workshop that I've given in the past in person. We now do that over 3 days, 2-hour sessions each. We have the voice and tone experience for those of you that really need to redo your brand voice and tone. Obviously, the pandemic has introduced new types of language and new types of thinking about communicating with audiences, and many brands are doing a refresh currently, and we certainly walk through that with you in about a 3-hour workshop to get your voice and tone appropriate. Part of the workshop is also learning to write in that new voice and tone. We have the content workflow creation workshop, which we're going to talk about today, just how to do content workflow. And if you need more help with your organization, please reach out to us. And then we do provide social media training for physicians. Obviously, that's becoming more and more necessary as physicians are on the front lines wanting to communicate directly with their audiences. We are very, very dedicated to creating thought leadership in this space. Obviously, we conducted original research for this webinar, and we probably do that around once a year to try to bring insights to the community. So you can find a lot of our information. We actually have a COVID-19 hub off of our website. And then the really fun thing that we've been doing that I am loving and learning so much from is we're interviewing people just like you about what you've learned during the pandemic. Our first interview was with Amanda Todorovich from the Cleveland Clinic, and you can find those videos on LinkedIn and YouTube and on links from our website. So please do avail yourselves of them. We mostly do healthcare marketers, although we have had a few different people. I just interviewed somebody from The Knot, which is a wedding channel, just to get a different perspective from another industry. But again, if you are a person who enjoys being interviewed, and believe me, you have something to share. I know a lot of people are like, well, what would I say? But believe me, if you've been on the front lines of this pandemic, you have plenty to share. So please reach out to us. Okay, with that, let's talk about what you're really all here for today, which is taking your content team virtual. So the challenges that we are all facing sometimes seem insurmountable. The goal of today is to give you sort of an overview of what other organizations have in their toolbox, and then to extrapolate from there how you might be able to fine-tune or even create a documented content strategy from a workflow perspective. So we're today, just step by step, we're going to go through the results of the content team survey. Then we're going to talk about how to create that digital workflow and what tools and scripts you might be able to use within your own organization in order to create that workflow, or like I said, fine tune it. And then we're going to talk just briefly about tips for working virtually. And obviously these are not tips like, you know, get good lighting, or it's more tips about how to create a really good workflow. So this data there's a lot of data here. We were very lucky. We got, like I said, 96 participants. Obviously more people responded, but we chose the participants who are appropriate from the healthcare marketing perspective. So there's a lot of data here, and we've split the data in a lot of different ways. So when I put all the data into the webinar, I was like, there's really a lot here, and I want to sort of elevate certain points that I think are going to be helpful for you today. So just so you know, when you get the slides, there's an appendix of all of the data. So if you want to comb through that data even more, you'll have it available to you. And of course, if you want to use this data to go to your executive team and say to them, you know, I want to show you sort of a broad span of what other hospitals in our space, you know, our employee size and are doing, certainly just email me and ask me for those slides. I'll be more than happy to send them to you so that you can just throw them into your presentation and you don't have to copy it off of a PDF. So from there, let's talk about the methodology that we used. So like I said, we had 125 respondents, 96 of them were appropriate for the survey. The survey was open from July 9th to July 27th. And we also offered 3 chances to win a $100 gift card to Amazon. Hopefully you are one of the people that won and are on the webinar, and we will be sending that to you as soon as the webinar is over. We will reveal it at the end. So let's look at who responded and where they're from, because one of the things we wanted to analyze was how big is an organization in comparison to the amount of people that they employ in marketing and content. So what we found was that 28 of respondents were from hospitals with 0 to 2,500 employees, which I actually found very, very interesting. And then 28% were from hospitals with 10 to 200,000, that would be a lot, 20,000 employees. And you can see from this little pie chart here how that breaks out. And you can see that the lowest number is from that 12% there is from hospitals with over 20,000 employees. And I think we know that those are probably either very large academic medical centers or hospital systems. It makes sense to me that the spread would go across like this, because obviously there are more smaller hospitals within the United States than there are these large, you know, sprawling systems. But that, I think, continues to change as we see larger health systems buying smaller hospitals. The next question that we asked was, how many people are on your core digital content team? So we wanted to know, what kind of support do you have? Do you have project managers, writers, editors, videographers, graphic designers? And then we were very, very clear that we did not want you to include contractors and freelancers in that information. So what we found is that most hospitals have a core content team of fewer than 5. Shocker, I'm sure, for all of you who are listening. They're like, 5 people, get me on, you know, I want a job there. But a quarter of the hospitals is a very large amount of people, with 20,000 plus employees, have a team of greater than 21 people. So I just want to give that some context here. If you're at an organization with 20,000 people, only a quarter of those people have a content team that's greater than 21 people. So a lot of them look a bit different. So let's just examine this a little bit carefully. And I found this slide really, really interesting, because I would have thought that the hot pink numbers would have just gone across diagonally, meaning the smaller your system, the smaller your content team, but it doesn't always correlate. And I think where we find the most interesting here, so let me just go through it. 0 to 5 members on the team. The hospital size that came into that was obviously the 0 to 2,500 employees. But then you see if you have 6 to 10 people on your core content team, they're 30% from 10 to 20,000 employees, but then it jumps back to the 11 to 15 from 2,500 to 5,000 employees. And this is always sort of the curious thing about data. It can tell us information, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why. And I don't really have a good answer for you. This makes the most sense to me that, 20,000 plus employees would have very large content teams. But again, I think what we can see is that a lot of us look around and think our competitors have so much more than we have in terms of resources, and I don't always think that that's true. If 20,000 plus hospitals have 20,000 plus employees, only 25% of them have these very large teams, and you can see it goes, sort of across the board here, then I think that that shows that everybody sort of needs as many resources as they can, and it doesn't always correlate with the size of the organization. And then this is just another visual way to look at that table. Some people are visual learners, some people like to read through the table. So we just tried to give you the information, and obviously when you get the slides, you can comb through this data a little bit more carefully, to make sure that you're get the information that you need to prove your points to either your executives or your team. Then we asked a question about the PR department. And the reason that I really wanted this question in here is that I find that unfortunately, a lot of hospital marketing departments are siloed. PR exists from digital, IT, and that can make it very, very challenging for you to do your jobs. And I think one of the things we've heard from this What Did You Learn podcast, Zoomcast that I've been running, is that everybody's finding that they've really integrated. It's become a team. Everybody values what everybody else brings to the table. There's so much work to go around. People can't say, I'm not going to do this, or this isn't part of my job description, because of how important it is to really integrate all those things when you're dealing with a pandemic. So we just wanted to know, is your PR department also responsible for creating digital web content other than press releases that they put up? And sometimes some people take those press releases, and this is a best practice in our opinion, to repurpose those press releases that are really meant for journalists into consumer-facing or physician-facing pieces. So 53% of respondents have a PR department who helps with digital content beyond press releases and blogs. I thought this quote was interesting, so thank you to all of you who add into the narrative. It really helps us sort of build that story around what's happening with the data. Our senior media relations person helps draft scripts, write blogs, serves as a copywriter and editor for other digital platforms where she is able to help, always advises the team on policy or contacts for additional details or confirmation of the content because of her rich history with the organization. She has a lot to do, this woman. And she's only one person serving in that PR role. So I think it's really interesting to see that there are situations where they're really involved. And then our PR department is beginning to post on our Twitter account for community engagement, event coverage, etc., but they aren't involved in our main digital content strategy. That's concerning. So in other words, again, I think that this example, the first quote showed how there is integration, and the second quote shows how there isn't integration. And when we look at the numbers, we can really see that sort of split where 53% do have their PR department involved in their digital content creation, and 34 do not, and then sometimes they do. And I think that what's the learning from this particular piece of data is, again, that movement towards integration and figuring out how PR does play a role in the larger digital content strategy. We don't have vice presidents of phone anymore. We don't have vice presidents of billboard. So I understand why we have VPs of digital, but I'm not 100% sure that as the marketplace continues to evolve and consumerism becomes even more important in healthcare, that we really can afford to be that siloed and that divided. So now we want to find out who owns content projects within organizations, but better yet, who initiates them, because unfortunately, sometimes the people who initiate them don't want to own the process. So here's what we learned from somebody who added into the narrative. Oh, I'm sorry, this is what we learned from the stats. Marketing typically initiates content projects 82% of the time, followed by web and the digital team, that's 58% of the time. Stakeholders initiate 51% of the time. And actually, when we looked at the data, we found that the smaller the hospital, the more stakeholders external to the marketing department initiated content projects. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because the smaller the organization, typically, the more the octopus arms of the stakeholders are out and coming back to the marketing department and saying, we need this content. This was hilarious. Who doesn't? You know, we are hoping to eventually have better governance, but currently these seem to come from every direction. So particularly because of the pandemic, I think a lot of people want to get in front of the audience. And so they're going to marketing and saying, like, help us figure this stuff out. So when we look at the data, we see that the web and digital team seems to be part of who initiates, but clearly marketing is the largest part. And then obviously, like we said, stakeholders fall into that 51% of the time. And like I said, we splice the data a couple of different ways. So you can look at it in the appendix. I did include this interesting fact about how marketing initiates the digital content projects most of the time, because I do think that that's a critical part of thinking about, well, in my organization and the size, where are these requests coming from, and how can I use my content governance and workflow that Ahava is going to present to us later to sort of help us sort through that and prioritize it. And again, this is just looking at that from a visual perspective. Now let's talk about how many full-time digital writers are on your staff. And when I looked at this question again, when I was preparing for the webinar, I kind of thought to myself, why did we include the word digital? I'm not sure 100%. I think writers are writers at this point and they do both, but there does seem to be sometimes in some hospitals that we engage with a difference. And in any case, we did use the cue of the word digital, and I want to be clear about that. Obviously, I'm sure this comes as a surprise to no one. Most hospitals are actually likely to have a small group of writers. The next statistic I'm going to show you actually really surprised me. They use content agencies and freelancers to supplement their writing staff. So 48% of content teams size 6 to 10 have 1 to 3 writers. And I'm going to show you a table that really sort of lays this data out really clearly. 25% of content teams with 21 plus people hire supplementary writing help. So again, this is a question of like, what's the data telling us? So my hypothesis is that if you have a content team that's 21 plus people, you probably have a budget where you can hire supplementary writing help. And obviously, when we talk about 21 plus people, we're not just talking about writers, we're talking about videographers and photographers and graphic designers and other people. So I think it's just interesting to see how people are choosing to use their resources. What we found here is that in terms of the writers, so you see it split out. So you can tell that, you know, the smaller the hospital, the less likely the chance is that they're going to have writers on staff. And you can see that sort of follow through here. What I thought was interesting, though, was that the 1 to 3 writer number seems to sort of go across the board. You can see statistically it's not really relevant out of a group of 100 people, that 39%, 38%, and 37%. So it seems to me that if you were going to look across the board, the 1 to 3 writers seems to be the average number that a hospital would have, not really dependent on the size of the hospital, although obviously that middle 5 to 10,000 is different. And then we can see, you know, in those size hospitals, it's more likely for them to have 4 to 6 writers, then 7 to 10 writers again, and then 10 plus writers. And we see really the only size hospital that has that is 7%. So, you know, writers are not typically employed by hospitals. And if they are, they're very, very small groups of people. What I would probably also surmise is that, and again, this is just a visual way of looking at this information, what I would also surmise is that it's potentially possible that those writers don't just serve as writers, but they also have other jobs like project managers, and maybe they're doing some of the social media work as well. What other in-house roles are on your content team? So we really wanted to know, you know, besides writers and editors, who's responsible to create content? So we asked questions around that. 74% of respondents have a graphic designer, which I was really surprised about, and I think that's fantastic and needed, particularly because graphic designers aren't only doing digital content, they're doing signage, you know, other types of things like that. 60% have a videographer, and 20% have no in-house support at all. I have to tell you, 15 years ago when I started Aha Media Group, these numbers would have looked very, very different. And I think it's fantastic that we're really seeing bringing in some of those resources in-house. I think that they're important for somebody on the brand to be responsible for them. And again, we can see just the data as it came out directly, but what I think is more interesting is looking at it by the size of the hospital, and you can see here that in-house videographers and in-house graphic designers really exist mostly at this sort of level of hospital, the 10 to 20,000, and then in-house studio 20,000+. That made a ton of sense to me, that you would have an in-house studio, because if you're that large, then you probably have the budget and the ability to do that. And then none of the above obviously is in this 0 to 2,500. You know, we talk to small hospitals all the time. They just don't have the resources to do things like that. And everyone is pressed rice paper thin now. But when we saw the quote of who doesn't initiate this project, we know that everybody's trying to accomplish so much and not enough resources to do it. And again, that was just pulling out that point of that 70% of hospitals that have 10+ writers on their team have an in-house studio. So I think that that shows that if you have that much writing staff, you're utilizing that writing staff also in terms of having a studio to support whatever scripts they're creating, or videos, or interviews, live interviews, and things like that, which certainly your writer should be a part of, because they maintain and manage the brand consistency. The million-dollar question, in my opinion, because I think project management is the sort of lone ugly stepchild of digital projects, but it was really great to see that almost 50% of respondents do have designated project managers. And you can see here that, you know, it was almost 50% were yes, and then the no and the project owner serves as the project manager were sort of inside of that other 50%, and then other was, you know, very small amount. What I would say is that there has to be air traffic control with the number of projects that are coming in. So somebody needs to be responsible for that. And we're going to talk later about how technology does not satisfy what the human brain can accomplish. And just throwing things into a project management system aren't going to help you get where you want to go. There needs to be somebody who's responsible to look at the totality of projects that are going on with the organization and figure out how they all fit together. Again, not everybody has the resources to do that, and that's an issue. But we're going to talk now later in the webinar about how you might be able to satisfy that, even though you don't have one particular person who has that role in their job description. This also really surprised us. So how much has adapting to virtual work challenged content workflow? And you know, a lot of people told us it really hasn't been that challenging. In fact, the surprise that I got from a lot of the leadership that I've interviewed, including you know, the CMO of UCLA, Tanya, you know, Amanda talked about this at the Cleveland Clinic. So why has this not been a challenge? And I think that people really figured it out fast. They understood that they needed to get it done. However, when you look at not the majority of the respondents, but pretty close, you see that, you know, quite a lot of them, if you add them all up, are challenged by it. But for the most part, I think people have figured out a way to adapt to it and make it work for them. But that was really surprising to me when I saw the next question, because my question is well, how have you adapted to it so easily if only 50% of you have documented workflow and 50% of you don't? So that makes me wonder about what the term challenged meant to some people, because it is very difficult to do this job and do it well without documentation around how you're doing it. You know, I always talk about workflow as it really just tells you who's passing the baton to whom. And so what we really want to understand is, you know, why hasn't it been that challenging, or why is it that challenging? And so again, like I said, we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can make it more or less challenging. We often, in fact, I think I'm going to start a software company, get questions about what project management do you use? Because, you know, we all know that there are some really great ones out there, and then there are some really huge ones out there, and not all of them do the same thing in the same way, and none of them are perfect. So how do you use those? And so we looked at some of the popular, not just the project management software, but the tools that people use in terms of making sure that their content is consistent and coherent. You can see here that, you know, very few people use swim lanes. That number is going to change after today because I think swim lanes are a huge lifesaver in a situation like the one we're in. Style guides, 60%. We were excited to see that. Content templates, that actually surprised me. Almost 60% of you are using content templates. And it also surprised me that 60% of people are using regular meeting cadences. And at the very end of the webinar, I'm going to give you a suggested meeting cadence. It would be fascinating for me to hear from you as an audience, whether it's here in the QA or over email afterwards, how you're finding what your regular meeting cadence looks like. We're very big believers in a daily huddle. Not every organization is. They can't even imagine how that would work. I'll tell a little story about how that's important. And here to the popular project management software, we did ask people to describe what they were using. These were the ones that came up the most. Certainly Workfront, like 7 or 8 of the 50 people who responded to this question are using Workfront, so that was the most popular one. But you can see that it's across the board. I mean, there's a lot of different project management softwares available, and you can see the breadth and depth of the ones that are being used. You know, all hospitals are really working with the things that are helping them the most, and probably frustrated sometimes with the limitations of that software. One of our values at Aha Media Group is always be learning. So we asked people, how often do you attend training or workshops to stay current with marketing best practices? 50% of you do monthly and quarterly, which is fantastic. I hope this is considered a training session and keeping up with best practices. But you can really see only 15, almost 16% of you said never. And then you can really see that a lot of people are really attending informational, some sort of training or some sort of furthering of their understanding of marketing to continue to be great. So that's really exciting. So that is the end of the survey presentation of what we learned, and there was a lot of really good data there for us. Again, data always should bring up some questions. It did bring up some questions. We're going to keep asking these questions and finding out, you know, what it means when people say that they are challenged or they're not challenged, or this is how many people we have on our core content team. So definitely some thoughts to think about. But again, like I said, I do think it helps you to present ideas to your team and maybe to your management about the kind of support that other people have within your particular size hospital and how you might be able to get more resources to do the jobs that you do. Even if you don't build an in-house studio, you can still go get, you know, outside support from freelance videographers or from agencies. Obviously, content writing help and content strategy help also can always be brought in from the outside. Obviously, somebody needs to own it on the inside, but it's certainly something that is available to you if you have the resources to do so. So when we talk about, so now I want to sort of, I can't use the word pivot, apparently. It's like the most overused word right now, and I feel bad for Ross on Friends, but so now we're just going to shift our focus a little bit to, okay, we looked at this data, we saw what other people are doing. Now let's look at what we can really learn, Ahava, about how to make this easier for ourselves. So I just want to define workflow and governance because I find that people often confuse the two, and that's not helpful when you're trying to set up a workflow because you start to bring in all these governance tools to do that, and so then you sort of mishkabobble them together, and that's the new business word of 2020, mishkabobble. So you sort of do that, and then, you know, it's like, well, it's not working because you're trying to do two things at the same time, and it's very hard to do that and do them both well. So workflow is really about what processes, tools, and human resources, we're going to talk a lot about this, are required for content initiatives to launch successfully and maintain ongoing quality. I should really bold the words that are the most important there. And then how do we, governance is more about how do we create consistent and controlled content to provide a coherent user experience, and you can move those C words around any way that you want, but really it's about how do we sound the same, how do we look the same, no matter where we are and no matter where our constituents are finding us. So the first thing that I would tell you is to create a playbook. And when somebody says a playbook, everybody steps back and is like, I am not writing 54 pages of documentation. I can't do that. Secret, that documentation is somewhere in your organization already, and what needs to happen is it needs to be brought into one place. So you don't have to get off this webinar and be like, oh my God, Ahava said create a playbook, I gotta go run and create a playbook, how am I gonna do that? I have 72 other things I need to do on my list, and they are far more important. No, 5 minutes a day, just do a search through your DAM, or through, which is your digital asset management tool, or through or through Dropbox or, SharePoint or whatever it is that you're using, and ask yourself, where can I find information? Where's the style guide? I need to link to the style guide. Where are scripts about introducing writers to doctors? Where's this? Where's that? And you can start to pull it together slowly. And this is one resource you can use, but certainly there are hundreds of resources on the web about how to create a great content playbook. We certainly have one that we use at Aha Media Group. Our account managers are in it every single day. We wouldn't be able to know how to move projects forward without it. And the reason that I show this lovely slide is not to make any football fans really sad. My husband is the commissioner of 3 fantasy football leagues. Let's have a moment of silence for me and sympathy. And every fall I always say, oh, my husband's mistress is back in town, but he's very sad because he doesn't think football is going to happen. But in any case, I bring up the slide because when you think about really successful teams and how they perform, they do it with playbooks, and they go over those plays again and again and again. And that's what content is, right? It's taking a ball and running it down a field and making that shot. Well, I know in football it's a little bit different. It's touchdown, not a shot. But you can tell my sports literacy is high up there. But the point is that, that's how great teams operate. They coordinate, they have documented strategies, they all know what they're doing, they all know their role on the field, they all understand the play, and that's really what a playbook is for. It's to help you get to that place. And the other thing that a content playbook does for you is that it helps you maintain that content quality and consistency across all your marketing activities. So again, workflow is figuring out the processes and tools you need. What the playbook does is it gets everything in one place so that people can look up style guide issues, they can look up content template issues, they can look up, what do we do in this situation? And that's really the way that a playbook works successfully. And obviously, if you have more questions about that, please reach out to me through the email that I'm going to give you at the end, because I can certainly provide other examples of how great playbooks work. I think the reason that I wanted to show this slide is really for those top level issues. And I think that great playbooks really put forward these 5 things, which are performance expectations, goal setting, transparency, tools, and effective meetings. So when you're thinking about putting your playbook together, I would think about these 5 issues. Now, the performance expectations is a little bit different because it's kind of hard to put that in a playbook and keep it consistent. What I think is that there should be like 3 bullets about like, what do we expect our content to always do for our audiences? Do we expect it to be helpful? Do we expect it to be instructive? Do we help it to move the content, the business strategy along? What are we trying to achieve with our content? And I think that when you do that, and when you say that very clearly in your playbook, you have a better chance of achieving that success. So now I want to talk about defining roles, because the number one thing that happens on content projects, particularly without a documented workflow and without very clear conversation, is that people mess up what they're supposed to do because they didn't know that they were supposed to do that, or they thought they were supposed to do that. And I'm sorry that this slide is a little bit not digitally optimized, but basically I bring back the football example. Everybody gets out on the field and they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing on that field. And when they don't, they fumble the ball, or they don't bring it where it's supposed to be brought, or they throw it in the wrong direction. And that's very embarrassing for them because they get paid a lot of money to follow a playbook. And so everybody knows on the field who they are and what they're doing. And that's exactly where your organization wants to get to when you're thinking about workflow. So a great opportunity for you is, after this webinar, just scribble down like the 15 roles that occur on projects, and you can look at this slide to give you some ideas. You can read other articles on the interwebs to find information about, who are the different people in a project. Ask your team, create a document, Google document or SharePoint document, and have people just throw ideas up there. Who are the 5 most important people on our projects? Who has to do with content projects? Who initiates them? Who gets them going? Who gets them finished? And I think by doing this, you really start to then narrow what exactly that role is. Now, I'm going to show you a slide that you're going to fall in love with. Don't worry, it's going to appear in your inbox shortly. This is an example of where you would take the chart beforehand, and then you would write a more detailed slide, really explaining what the responsibilities are of that particular role. Again, notice I didn't say people. It's the role that person plays in the project. So this is subject matter expert role details. You're gonna love that do not part, right? They don't set voice, tone, or messaging. They don't add additional details that push scope. They don't set marketing strategy. But again, most slides are just like, this is what the person does. And sometimes you also say, this is what the person doesn't do. So if your air traffic control person doesn't manage detailed projects, that needs to be included in a description of what they do. A lot of this stuff is available to you. It's in job descriptions. You know, you may have it in sort of other materials that you've put together for your organization. And I really think you can actually ask the people who play the different roles. You can give them an example of that slide and say to them, can you write what it is that you do and what you're really not responsible to do? This role definition is so incredibly important. What's also important is that, and I talk about this a lot, is that at the beginning of every project, and I'm talking about like writing a blog post, there needs to be some sort of project kickoff, even if it's only with like the two people who touch the blog, which is the writer, the editor, and maybe the CMS author. That I don't necessarily know that you need the CMS author, is that somebody says, I'm the writer researcher on this blog, and you're the editor, and you're the person responsible for moving it to the CMS author. It's fast, right? It's like, okay, you know, my daughter plays basketball. For somebody who doesn't know that much about sports, my life is really surrounded by it. My daughter plays basketball, and she talks about, like, before they get on there and they're looking at those plays, they're like, okay, you're the center, you're always the center, but you're, I don't know the names, you're front guard or whatever. So the point is the point is that, you know, people have to know what their job is. And they also have to know what their job isn't, but they have to decide at the very beginning of a project, this is the role I'm going to play on this project. So if the person says, well, I'm doing research on, you know, mental health, behavioral health, and how it's affecting working moms, you know, I'm going to talk to this SME. That SME now plays a role, and that SME is important. If later the SME bows out or isn't available or can't do it, then somebody has to decide who the next SME is and who's that person to do that. Who plays that role? Is it the writer? Is it the marketing manager? Who is that person to do that? And so by defining those roles at the beginning of every single project, you will have a better chance of getting the ball down the field. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about, you know, creating that playbook and making sure that you've defined the roles within the organization, I want to talk a little bit about tools and scripts. So again, you may be sitting here thinking, this woman is in a fantasy land. I don't have time to create all this stuff, but I promise you this content is out there, and you may have to spend some time editing it and curating it and collating it, and another word, putting it together. But at the end of the day, you organizing it, you will get to a place where you will have something like this. And think of it as like a 4 to 5 month project. You know, we're in this for the long haul, so it doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but you want to sort of make this a team initiative to get it going. This is the most important thing I'm going to tell you today, besides the fact that I know nothing about sports, which is that the right tools for your organization are rooted in your culture and your attitude. So do not pick tools that are not going to help you, because I promise you it's going to end up being a complete and total disaster, and no one is going to adopt them. So what do I mean when I say culture and attitude? So we have you know, really clear value in our organization that we go above and beyond no matter what. Part of going above and beyond no matter what is serving our customers a consistent experience as much as we possibly can. And content is complicated, we all know that, but that's really our guarantee and our promise, not only to our clients, but also internally to ourselves. So if documents are missing, or they're out of place, or Salesforce doesn't have the right information, or Basecamp is jumbled and unorganized, everybody gets frustrated, because we've promised each other that we're going to do the best and that we're going to go above and beyond no matter what, and you're not pulling your end of the rope, you're not picking up the slack. And so thinking about how your teams operate together and what's going to work best for them is really going to make sure that these tools are used in a smart way. So I want to spend some time now on content workflow, because I know that that's probably one of the most difficult parts about running a virtual content team. And not to flex here, but I've been running a virtual content team now for 15 years, and I can tell you that if workflow isn't clear, you run into a lot of difficult conversations. Workflow and role responsibility work in tandem. If roles aren't clearly spelled out and what each person is responsible for in each phase, workflow will not matter. No one will care. No one will look at it. So this is just an example, and it probably looks super scary, but it's not. It goes in phases. So we start with what are the typical phases of a project. And notice this takes you through to project close. This is not just like writing and editing and getting it up online. I mean, it's everything. And so really, again, the same people that are putting in those roles into that document that you have open for brainstorming can be the exact same people who think about each of the steps of a project and start to brainstorm together. What is the most important thing that we do at the beginning of a project? What's the next phase that we go to? How does that baton, how does that ball get passed down the field? What roles and responsibilities take place within this workflow? And so the first thing I would do is just map it out like this. Don't make it super complicated. Just try to figure out, what it looks like. But then once you get this on paper and you really have sort of not clear perfectly, but you have like a general shape or a sketch to the way that a content project runs in your organization. And obviously you may change this depending on, is it a website article? Is it a blog? Is it a social media post? But let's just start with, a basic web article that you're going to be writing, a piece of evergreen content maybe. But then you create swim lanes out of each of the phases. So when you look back at, identify content need as the first one, this is where you slide the roles and responsibilities into it by making sure that each person's name is associated with whatever they are responsible to do in that phase of the project. So again, each of these aqua columns here would have its own swim lane associated with it. Or what you can do is you can divide these into phases. So identify, content need, project requests, and planning are all part of one swim lane. You can put that on one slide, then you can do research, pre-content creation, and content creation on another slide, and then review, approval, publishing, distribution, and project close could be on a third slide. So you have 3 swim lanes for, to demonstrate what your content workflow looks like. And again, these are the roles that people play. So the stakeholder has to be identified. Who is that? What community member are we serving? Who's the project lead? Who owns this project and makes sure that it gets going? Who's the researcher on the project? It might be the writer, or it may be the marketing manager, or it may be a combination of roles. Who's the channel manager on this? Is it somebody who manages our social media? Remember the PR, that narrative description of like, in our organization, sometimes like they handle Twitter. Well, if they're doing that, then they need to be part of the digital content strategy. You can see here what a swim lane would look like, fully designed out, where you see each of the people that's in that particular role and what they have to do, and you can follow along where it gets handed off to. So now the writer gives it to the editor, but what does the editor then have to do? They don't go down to the stakeholder, they go back up to the writer, and then the writer then sends it to the stakeholder, and then it goes back up to the project manager, then it goes back down to the writer, and then it goes back down to the stakeholder finally for the final review. So these are the swim lanes that we use at Aha Media Group, and what's so important about them is that we program them into Basecamp before the project even starts. So we have this like empty project template. We start a project, we put it in, we already know what the different steps are. We can also then, edit things, take them out depending on the differences of the project, but we're prepared for the way the baton gets passed. And if there's a problem, if we have to go in and figure out where a project might have gone wrong or been stuck, very often it's in this passing off. And so we really need to make sure that we follow this process. Every time we step outside a process, we suffer. And it's always funny, I feel like, why don't we feel the pain? Like we haven't felt the pain yet, but we've gotten really good at keeping it buttoned up. And that's of course my A team of my staff that really knows how to get that stuff done. So here's another example of a creative agency that created a marketing strategy workflow, and you can see here that they also put in the amount of time that it would take to do each of these steps. And I think that's important. I don't know that I'd start there. I think that's a little bit advanced unless you're running on Agile, and your Agile also has to include your content development. But I think it's just another way of looking at it graphically and figuring out, again, what's the culture of your organization and how do you demonstrate this information in a way that's going to help them not only absorb it, but use it. These are editorial guidelines. So again, it doesn't have to be very long, and it can be a letter written to dear writer. You're going to see this on the next slide, to the content creator. These are the things you need to think about. We just want you to know, like, look this over the first few times you do a project. You probably won't have to look it over again for a while, but let's make sure it's documented about what we're all trying to accomplish so that you don't hand me a piece of content that then looks completely different than what I was expecting. Or you completely ignore our brand guidelines and you refer to us as a naming convention we barely use anymore. So these can be very helpful. And again, editorial guidelines can be wrapped into your style guide as well. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on style guides. I could tell from the data that you all know what a style guide is and that you use them a lot. I think, though, the one thing I do want to say is that what you want to include in your style guide is not just where you deviate from AP, but also, again, some of those editorial guidelines and tips for writing. Your content template should be in your style guide. A link to your visual design guidelines should be in your style guide. That stuff should be available to your content creators, so it's easy for them to navigate around all the different needs and stringencies that your brand has. Checklists, my favorite. So this checklist was written, I don't even know, 2013. I read the book, The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, who is a doctor, and he talks about how the WHO wanted to change the amount of infection, lower the amount of infections that occurred in surgeries. So they borrowed this from the aviation and construction industries and said, well, what if we created a checklist for operating rooms where at the very beginning of the surgery, the person in charge, right, the coach calling, the quarterback calling the plays, usually a nurse, the surgical nurse on duty, the head, would say, Dr. X, you're going to do this, and anesthesiologist, you're going to do this, and everyone would say, yep, no, yep. And then they would safely help the patient, operate on the patient and control infection. Did you wash your hands 30 times? Did you, make sure that we have extra iodine in the room? I don't remember the specifics, but they did. They lowered it significantly. And so I got inspired because I was creating so much content as a freelance writer. That was sort of the beginning of Aha Media Group. And I thought to myself, this is amazing. Like, I need a content checklist so that every time I send a piece of content to a client, it has everything in it that I always want to make sure. And then I just go down that checklist every time. And this has been downloaded more than 10,000 times from the Content Marketing Institute's website. So again, you can find that easily on our website. It's not gated. This is our governance checklist that you can also find on our website. And the links are here. But again, thinking about some of these things and what are you trying to do? You can see here, map current workflow to understand weaknesses. Again, that's something that you can try. I would just start from scratch at this point. Clarify roles and responsibilities each and every time. You can see a lot of the things I talked about today are within this checklist. A timeline. Everybody comes to us and says, Aha Media Group, we need content like that, make it happen. And our response is if you get back to us, we'll get you what you want on time, right? So what's really beautiful about timelines is that they do hold people accountable. People have legitimate excuses. The SME didn't get back to me. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Black Lives Matter happened. There's all kinds of reasons why content projects get delayed. But making sure that the dates are there from the beginning and that you're adjusting out helps hold everybody on the team accountable for, well, why hasn't this gotten done yet? And then the last thing I would say is scripts. So very few organizations use scripts. And the reason that they don't is because every marketing manager and every person communicating has kind of a different tone that they want to use when they do so. Consistency is really critical when operating across an organization, especially a smaller one where people are probably going to interact with you more frequently than they would, say, in a larger organization. So you should have scripts for touch points because, and then you can take these scripts and you can edit them. I mean, this is what we give our clients, right? We say add in this information or whatever makes sense to you at this point. And the reason that that's so incredibly important for people is that your stakeholders get used to getting this information and it's in a consistent way. And you as a project manager or as a writer don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So scripts can be incredibly important for you for getting your work done in a consistent way in terms of a workflow. So we're getting close to the end, so I just have a couple more slides to go through. Obviously, technology is big in our world. Technology is not your workflow and it's not your governance. It can help support those things. People are the most important thing. So again, like I said, the example of our Basecamp is perfect, right? We have this Basecamp, it's set up, it's got all of the different parts of the workflow within it. But we go in, and when we create a new project, depending on the project needs, we edit that workflow. So again, technology is that support. We don't want to have to reinvent a Basecamp every single time we create one for every project that we do. But we can't use it to its full ability unless we add that human element into it. So that's the same thing about Slack and email. Those things are very helpful to communicate with people, but sometimes things get lost in written translation. Use the phone. I'm a huge believer in the lost art of the phone call. Very often you can solve a problem in 3 minutes on the phone that took you 5 emails back and forth within 3 hours. So definitely, in particular, because you're in this virtual workflow environment, please do avail yourself of the phone, get all your colleagues' numbers, have them programmed into your phone. It will make your life a lot easier. And then the last thing that I promised to present is these meeting cadences. And I just want to be clear that these really do work. So I am part of the Entrepreneurs Organization, which helps entrepreneurs. I don't really think of myself as an entrepreneur. I'm more like a small business owner. But it's really helpful for me to learn all of the best practices for growing a successful, viable business. And they kept talking about this daily huddle, like your company has to huddle every day. Different departments of your company have to huddle every day. And like I said, I've been running a virtual team for years and years and years. And my director of content at the time, Emily Broderick, I said to her, they keep saying that we should run this huddle. And she's like, well, why don't we just try it and see how it goes? Like, how bad could it be? And the huddle has to be at an odd time. So we started doing it at 9:37, but then we went to 10:07 because we started to get people working on the West Coast and we didn't want them to get up at an ungodly hour. And it transformed our company. I mean, really, like, we got around on a Zoom, we went alphabetically, and it was like, what did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? Where are you stuck? And again, by being together once a day and talking about where we were stuck, we were able to solve problems much more quickly. I will tell you, it takes discipline. So you need to put somebody in control of the huddle to make sure it doesn't get out of control and people just start talking about, like what happened on Love Island or Love is Blind or one of those kind of shows the night before. So I don't even know if they do nights before anyway. Television shows, it's all streaming. But in any case, this is a really valuable guide towards meeting cadences. You definitely want to have a weekly meeting also to look at all the projects that are in the queue. If you can do monthly meetings, that can also be incredibly helpful. And then we recommend quarterly offsites. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do that right now. However, I do recommend that you do set aside at least 90 minutes to 2 hours, and you can take breaks, obviously. Within those large time periods, those are exhausting to be on video conference calls, but I do think it's valuable to make sure that you're meeting quarterly to talk about all of these different things. And so, in summary, without documentation, consistency is almost impossible. We all know this. It's funny, I'm going to reveal my nerdiness. I have a dinner grid it's 4 weeks, and it talks about the different dinners that I make. And there's a shopping list associated with each week because my husband likes to go grocery shopping and I don't. So he'll just take the list for that week and go to the grocery store. And the first time I did the list, I forgot to include peppers in one of the weeks that I needed the peppers for. And he came back and he's like, this is a content strategy fail, right? Because I didn't have the documentation around the consistencies. So now you have a lot of insight into my relationship with my husband. You want to get everyone on the same page by defining roles. And again, just every single time, this is the role I'm playing on this project. You want to create workflow scripts and other tools to make it clear who's it passing to next. How does workflow work? Again, I am a huge fan of the swim lane, and it's not that difficult to create. You don't need a beautifully designed one. You just need it to be clear to people about how to use it. Technology only works when it's consistently used by everyone. We saw that in the comments. And so again, those are support systems for you. Technology is not going to solve your content problems. And then get help when you need it. So, if you need help figuring this out, call us, call somebody who knows how to do it, because, we're probably at the beginning of this. I hate to break it to us. I'm super bummed about it also. I was hoping it would be over 700 days ago. But, these bad habits are going to form if you don't get it under control now. So let's make sure you have the right documents in place. Now for everyone's favorite part, and then we'll get to questions. The survey winners are Chelsea Osling at Children's Wisconsin. I hope I pronounced that right. Laura Gada at UF Health, and David Titel, who's actually a friend of mine. I said to my team, he's a friend of mine, but they were like, well, we picked it randomly, so it has nothing to do with you, at MIT Medical, and they will be getting their prize very soon by code, because Amazon knows how to do that well. And so with that, we have about 7 minutes left for questions. So I would love to hear from you about any questions you have about workflow, and what we can do to support you at this time. Pam, thank you for supporting my fantasy football pain. It's real. The struggle is real, and I think people should recognize that. So let's go ahead and answer any other questions that people might have.
Okay, here's a question, Ahava. It was interesting to see that so many hospitals use freelance writers and content agencies. Do you have any advice for managing expectations up front when starting relationships with either freelancers or agencies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think one of the things that I didn't say that I'm glad that this question came up is, if you don't have documentation, it's going to be really hard to manage those relationships with freelancers and content agencies. I think the bottom line is, and particularly now in the pandemic, I mean, we're busier than we've ever been, luckily, is that people really need this information, and they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to create it all themselves. And they're running around managing so many different expectations that taking the creative time it needs to really write a really great piece of content or create a really great video is challenging. And so they're obviously going to look for those supplementary resources. I think the way that you manage it is, again, you talk about the roles and responsibilities, you talk about how the project is going to run. I know that when we begin new projects with new clients, we sort of set that expectation of, we do a whole kickoff, we do a whole slide presentation with each. We have 10 different steps that we use to create content projects. And one of the things we talk about is, you need to get back to us. You need to communicate with us. You need to let us know what's going on, because if you don't, we can't do our jobs effectively. And obviously, we're going to customize the project for the culture of the organization we're working for. But if you're doing a good job at managing your supplementary resources, whatever they may be, agencies who do your graphic design, who do your web stuff, spend the time at the beginning to make sure the relationship is going to go smoothly by talking very frankly about what the expectations are for everybody's roles and responsibilities on those teams. I hope that answers the question. Oh, I see a really great question.
Go ahead, Ahava. If you see it, go ahead.
Okay, Joy. Joy's a good friend of mine. Okay, so Joy, I can't believe you keep coming to these webinars. It's like, haven't you learned everything already? All right, I'm having a difficult time getting introverts to speak up during meetings. Yes, it's a big problem. This has always been a problem, but video conferencing is making it worse by literally spotlighting speakers. Advice on how to engage these people. It's really fascinating that you say this, because my husband is an economist and he runs a team of economists, and you can imagine economists are not the most vivacious people. So this is a problem that he had, and I gave him this piece of advice, and now I'm going to give it to everybody here, is that tell people what you expect them to say at the meeting. So before the meeting, I would say at least one business day, send out a fast agenda saying, this is what the meeting's going to be about. I expect everyone in the meeting to discuss these 2 bullet points, and we're going to go around the room alphabetically and get everyone's point of view. And that way, if people know that they have to talk, then they're going to talk. The other thing to do is to spend 5 minutes at the beginning of the meeting and say, these are the things we're going to talk about. I just want to give everybody 2 minutes now to think about what they want to say. Feel free to write it down, and then when we get to you, we'll be able to get there. And then I think just calling on people, like, it's not fun. I don't enjoy doing it. Certainly when I run workshops, sometimes I just have to call on people, but we want to get people inspired and motivated and involved. And if they're not going to talk on video conferencing, which is where we are right now in the world, they're going to lose out on their own professional experience. And so I think if you see this continuing, you need to just call that person up and say, hey, I've noticed you haven't been as vocal in meetings. Can we talk through some of the feelings that you're having so that we can find a way to get over them, because your input is so incredibly valuable, and I want to make sure your voice gets heard. Jessica, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, here's another one. I was surprised to see that 50% of the healthcare organizations you surveyed had dedicated project managers. My organization doesn't. Do you have advice for making a business case to executives for hiring project managers? Our leadership seems eager to have more content creators on our team.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think the best way to do that is to show where the pain points are happening, because executives respond to how pain within your process affects their bottom line. So you can say something like, we were supposed to create 5 pages of content around what to expect when you come back for elective surgery, in phase 2. Unfortunately, because we didn't have a project manager, we were unable to, to get that content out in time because we didn't have somebody who was making sure that things were running. And obviously, I think that's something you run up the chain. You don't tell that to an executive because they're going to be like, figure that out. But I think you sort of explain to your manager, you show him or her 3 cases of where this is happening, and just saying, I really think that we either have to take somebody on the team and make them half-time project manager, but I don't want to do that because that person's a talented content creator. How can we find some support within the organization? And maybe you can find, we provide project management services at Ahava Media Group. You can find an agency who can help you with that, or you might be able to find a part-time person who's willing to do work like that. Certainly everyone's virtual now, so it's not as difficult. We work remotely is a great place to post jobs like that. So definitely finding somebody to help you, I think, is critical, and that's the way to sort of demonstrate to your management team that we really need help. Because if we don't get the help that we need, in terms of air traffic control and project management, we're not going to be able to satisfy your need for content. And I think one of the things that really can help an organization is thinking about content as a product and comparing it to that. To when you're talking to management is like, if the conveyor belt isn't working, then you can't put together the car. You know what I mean? So if there's nobody making sure that the trains are running on time, you can't get people where you need them to go. So too, if we don't have a conductor, i.e. a project manager, we can't get it done. Okay, thank you everybody for being here. We're at the top of the hour, so I want to be respectful of your time. Again, if you have any questions, please ask. We will be in touch with those of you who won the Amazon gift card, and we will also be sending out the slides and the video recording. So thank you so much for being here. And again, like I said, if you can give us ideas for topics you would like for us to cover in the future, if we see ideas within the same universe, we will definitely put something together for you. Thank you so much and have a great day.